Now I want to rank
yeah, I'm sure that I just haven't thought about that as a concept existing. There's got to be some kind of core.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Because I just realized that those two are two different things, and so yeah. Just gonna.
Be sorry. In high school. Well, I said that to him. I was like say.
We see now because it's 15, so I think we can pretty much get started. Right now there's recording just so that we can have full viewers later on, and we're going to pass it through different networks as well. Right, so welcome.
Do you know if it's picking up audio okay?
Okay.
That's what checking.
Yeah.
In front.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Just put it in front of everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Leah, do you know how to activate the just to test this as well? Because
Hello.
That's my you have to enable it on the panel that's on the desk.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so
and then what is the
I'm
this says
recording
it's
it
on.
through Zoom here.
Yeah, but then sorry.
There's two modems here.
Hello. Hello. Is that that's working.
Okay. Beautiful.
Was that
We can then do that.
Oh, probably.
All right. I think I'll do exactly that then. Sorry.
Oh no.
There it is.
She asked me is
Testing. Oh, yeah, it's working. Cool. Is it? Yeah, sharing in a moment. And we're gonna basically pass this around as part of as we go. Okay. Welcome everyone. Okay, I'm just nervous. Sorry. Okay. Welcome everyone. My name is Khan, and I'm one of the Disabilities Officers at the University of Sydney Student Representative Council. We are part of the Disabilities Collective, so a collective of, sorry. A collective of of disabled students, and we do all kinds of activities, so please get involved. Welcome today to our disability and higher education panel, and we're going to talk everything to do with the intersection between disability, higher education, but also with regards to the recently just wrapped up final report of the Disability Royal Commission and what it had to do with higher education, or more likely its absence. Right. Before we start, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge that the meeting that we are holding today in the University of Sydney Quadrangle, of all places, it's an inherently colonial institution and place. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And within just in the context, of course, of next week, Voice to Parliament referendum, however you feel, please do your research, discern carefully. There are a lot of matters that have been ignored by governments, Labour, coalition, and every shade in between with regards to the health, welfare of Indigenous people, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people. Sovereignty has never been ceded. This is stolen land, and we must remember that. And to that end, the Disabilities Collective do our activism in that context as well. So discern carefully. We don't have a position, so just think about it and cast your vote however it may be. Right. Right. First of all, I'd like to introduce our three panelists today who have taken their time today, and of course, we thank them very much in a very, I guess, very rainy day as well. Right. First of all, I will go from left to right. Sorry, my sense of direction might be a bit short for the moment. Sorry. Right to left, sorry. Right to left. So Robin, beginning with Robin. Robin is a queer writer, artist, and historian. They are studying for a PhD in history at the moment at the University of Sydney, right here as well. Their work has been published in the journals Overland, Cordite, Meanjin, the Australian Poetry Journal, and Lilith, a Feminist History Journal. Among others, including Disabled Ani as well. Our own autonomous edition of in the Disabilities Collective. More recently, they curated a trans history display in the Amaze Gallery at the State Library of New South Wales as part of their World Pride exhibits. Eames was also a Disabilities Officer in 2018 and continues to campaign for disability justice. Next up, in the middle, we have Ebe Ganon. Ebe is an equity and accessibility specialist working in the public sector who uses their lived and professional experience to advocate for better outcomes and access for disabled people in the tertiary, public, and fitness sectors. Ebe is currently a board director of Children and Young People with Disabilities Australia, which is a big organization based for young people with disabilities, broadly speaking, up to around 25-year-old, if I am speaking correctly. And they are a member of Fitness Australia Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and also a Masters of Disability and Inclusion student currently at Deakin University. Ebe co-authored together with Chloe the CYDA, so Children and Young People with Disability Australia, LivedX, What Young People Said series and papers which propose a range of recommendations for improved disability and accessibility in settings including higher education. Now, we also have Chloe Hoglace coming from a former student at Monash University in Victoria. Oh, sorry. Chloe is a disabled advocate and graduate civil engineer, graduating from Monash, and she has been involved with Children and Young People with Disability Australia as well since 2020, and is currently also one of their board directors. And Chloe also co-authored, as I said before, the LivedX series and papers together with Ebe. Right. We'll now get to discussing. Basically, the format of the panel will be, we'll have a series of questions to talk about disability education. We'll also get into the university's court as well, because that's one of the tranches reforms that are currently going through. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we officially start as well. So if there are bathrooms just outside, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's the wrong room. I don't.
It was a cleaner.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry. Just a little housekeeping before, just for those of us who are not familiar with the university campus, if you go outside later over there through the arch, on the left-hand side, there will be a women's bathroom. There will also be men's bathroom on the right-hand side at the opposite side of the quadrangle. And there will also be, if you go towards the library, if you want water later on, there will be clean tap water at the ready. All right. I guess in terms of the first part of our panel, we'll focus on disability and higher education. I guess the first question I wish to ask is, and this will include for everyone, so feel free to, I guess, then I'll pass on the little speaker, the recording module, in order to speak. First of all, with 17% the statistic is that only 17% of disabled student people, compared to 35% more in the general population, have at least a bachelor's degree. So disabled people in Australia at least have somewhere like half as much in terms of a degree attainment rate. What are some of the factors behind this in your view and experience? And yeah.
So I think with stats like that, it's always tricky because we're not seeing the breakdown of that data. So we don't know how that further collapses in terms of First Nations disabled people, in terms of queer disabled people, in terms of like age. I know that there are a lot of older disabled people who look at me and are like, wow, it's fucking amazing that you can go to university. Because when they were young, they were just like, that's not a place that we're allowed to go. And I nearly absent failed out of undergrad because I couldn't get into the fucking classrooms. And obviously there's a lot of physical barriers, there's a lot of institutional barriers, there's a lot of financial barriers, there's a lot of attitudinal barriers. I think it's hard to make broad claims because for every population, there's particular concerns. For international students, I think one of the biggest things is just that they can't fucking study part-time, which I think is horrific. But yeah, just structurally, there's too many barriers to name. I was really struck that in the DRC recommendations, there was nothing about tertiary education. It was all about primary and secondary education. And the only time universities were mentioned at all in the entire document was in one quote from a parent.
Yeah, super good point about, I suppose, the intersectionality of those experiences, because we know that lots of, student groups on campus and student groups and non-students will have that intersectional experience of various other factors, including their disability and impairment experiences, that are going to create a really complex experience for them, and makes it really difficult to access the services that do exist to help with attainment. But even if you do manage to access those services, there are a lot of gaps. The echo. There are a lot of gaps in the services that exist, and they're really not tailored for disabled students in a modern university context. Universities have changed a lot over the last few decades, to the point where we know many more students are working at the same time as studying, and we know many more students, and an increasing number of students, will be working full-time while studying. So obviously that's all going to conflate together to decrease attainment rates. But also something that I've been looking at in my research is around aspiration building. So from a young age, how much are people with disability exposed to the opportunities of going to university, and how much is that actually sold to them as possible? There is no research around how that does or doesn't, though we can make some good guesses, occur in segregated and special settings. And so I think we can fairly safely say that that is contributing to lower enrolment rates. But also, what is not in this statistics is the difference in the attrition or the dropout rate. We know that there are probably a large number of disabled students who are entering university but not completing, and that's a really big problem. If we can't make the experience of disabled students who are already here now really strong and really effective, then it doesn't set such a great opportunity or example for people who will come later down the track.
Yeah, to add to that, I remember when we were writing the tertiary education paper, one of the recommendations that we put out was that there's a lot of goals from whatever level of government it is for disabled students enrolling in university, but there's nothing about completing university. And another thing that came, because we held focus groups with young people, that's how we wrote these papers, and the transition from high school mainstream high school into university, it's very difficult. You can't just carry across your accommodations and all of these things that you've already built up. You've got to start again at the uni and then advocate again, and you don't really know what's on offer. In my experience, towards the end, when I was a bit more comfortable with accessing disability services, it's really down to our imagination what supports we could get, which is like, I never got to use them because of the pandemic, but like I had, you know, a room by myself for exams, and I needed to be near a window, and I had all of these things. And then in my last final assessment, I remember there was a huge portion of my grades for body language while presenting. And I was like, hang on, like, I actually don't think that's fair, even if I might be able to do it. And so I went and saw if I could get that taken out of my grading rubric. And they did, with a letter from my GP. But that's another thing, like a psychiatrist, that's many $100s, you know. Unis, once you're in, it's usually pretty great, but getting into disability services, usually you have to have access to reports, and many unis have different levels of how much information you have to give them. At Monash, I know they just focus on what adjustments you need, but I know other unis want to know like your diagnosis and things like that, and a lot of information, which makes it very difficult to access. And then there's the age-old, like, so many disabled students will say, like, oh, I got 2 degrees, like my actual degree and one in advocacy, because you have to spend the whole time fighting, actively fighting to be there. So yeah, it doesn't make it easy. Like, you have to be more dedicated than the non-disabled student to stay at uni. Like, you can't just default to uni like some people can.
You've already sort of made one of the points I was going to make. But yeah, at USyd for disability services, you have to have a diagnosis, and you have to fill out a separate report, a separate application form for every single disability that you have to get accommodations for them. And then the range of accommodations they can give you are really, really limited. And like, one of the issues that I had was attendance, and I was HDing the assignments. I was doing well in the class. I was doing all the readings. I chose subjects based on whether they were recorded or not. So I was doing all the lectures, but I couldn't reliably make it into tutorials every single week. And they were like, we can't waive that. And then they'd just be like, oh, just talk to your lecturer and they'll arrange something. And then often the lecturer just wouldn't, and would be like, just come to class. And I'd be like, I fucking can't. But yeah, it's the hoops you have to jump through. And particularly for I'm no longer a young people. I'm 30. But when you're like just starting university, often people aren't diagnosed yet. There's a lot of conditions that show up in your early 20s, or people just become disabled over time or with age. And even like, I know people who have like MS and were diagnosed quite young, but just never bothered registering for disability services because it was such a fucking hassle, and also because there just wasn't a lot that they could actually help with. But yeah, it's just, it's ableism all the way down, basically.
Yep. I'd like to actually, touching on to all of the things that that you guys have said just now. One thing that really stood out, I guess multiple things stood out, but one of them was around disability services and then registration. Obviously, I mean, I read through the stats and stuff, but they don't really capture, I guess, how like the difficulties that we have in terms of disabled students have in terms of trying to get a diagnosis, trying to get reports, and then be able to access adjustment or accommodations. One thing that I remember was how wildly it fluctuates, the rates. One thing that, broadly speaking, people said was that over COVID, there were more students who access the services. whatever factor there is, maybe, but before and even now, the rates really fluctuates. I think at USyd is something like a third of students who register as interest. There's no actual number for how many students are actually registered, because there are several hoops in terms of even publicly available data, in terms of when they say who, like say at enrollment, they had a little question that asked, I remember saying, would you like to access disability services? If you tick yes, they'll send an automated email saying, here's some of the services that are available. But then you have to jump through several hoops before you actually get there, and they don't even have the actual number. So I guess my question is, what would comprise, I guess, I mean, there are many, I get that there are many multiple dimensions to this questions, but what are some of the things that you think you would have liked to have during during your degree that would have helped your studies?
The things that I found most helpful were just flexibility, and I found like over and over through my undergrad and through postgrad study, it's just been having people in the department willing to bend the rules and help me figure things out. At one point when I was doing honors, I couldn't go to one of the seminars because the lecturer refused to move to a wheelchair accessible room. So I didn't have like half of the credit that I needed, and a bunch of people just scurried around behind the scenes and moved me into a gender studies seminar in second semester that shouldn't have been equivalent, but they were just like, we'll make it work. And I am so grateful to those workers who made that happen, but it shouldn't have taken people going out of their way to do a bunch of unpaid labor to make it possible for me to graduate. And as a teacher, I also have tutored as a casual tutor, and I was really, really conscious that the disability supports that were provided were incredibly limited. Even just as a teacher, I think it's good that they don't disclose your disability and just tell you what accommodations you need. But I was like, I actually want my students to feel like they can tell me if they're dyslexic or if they're deaf or if they're blind, because that will change how I provide the materials for this subject. I am so happy to like make audio recordings of things, or to just make sure everything's in screen readable formats, or to like, I didn't mark down for stuff like spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes anyway, but like it would change the advice I would give them as feedback. But the whole subject, I was just like, I will fight God and the university to make sure you get whatever you need in terms of accommodations. And then I guest lectured, because all of this was over Zoom. And then I guest lectured in person. I think all my students were just like, oh, that's why. But I think it shouldn't have to be up to individual teachers. I think that flexibility should be built in to the structure. And I think part of the problems are just with the pace and the expectations of being able to move through a certain workload at the same speed as your peers all of the time. And that's not just a disability issue, that's an issue with single parents, that's an issue with people with caring responsibilities, that's an issue with people who need to fucking work at the same time as they're studying. And the whole point of like universal design is just designing for as many people as possible, as flexibly as possible, and having multimodal options so that you don't have to be like, there is only one pathway, and if you can't like journey down that pathway, you're fucked.
I'm really glad that you brought up the topic of staff, because at the end of the day, staff, working conditions are student learning conditions. And prior to moving into government, I was working in tertiary management. So I was working in administration at ANU. And one of the biggest systemic barriers to delivering great universal education is just the fact that teaching is really undervalued at universities. If you look at the way that academic promotion works, it is so much easier to get promoted when you are a research dominant academic than when you are a teaching dominant academic. When you have a high teaching load, your performance is almost solely measured through, I'm not sure what they're called here, but student evaluations, which we know have a lot of problems for, historically underserved and marginalised communities, and can be affected by lots of things that are completely outside your control, including your experience of disability, being a person of colour, all of those factors that come in when people rate their educators. And we know studies after studies after studies demonstrate how those factors come into play constantly. And the fact that we undervalue teaching so much means that those academics and educators are forced to spend time they don't have on research work they don't have funding for, with hours that they're taking away from their families in order to progress through their career, rather than spending undercompensated and under-recognised hours preparing accessible materials. Most universities don't have a central service where you as an academic can go and say, hey, help me make my materials accessible. Those services exist for students sometimes, so the student has to then take the burden on of, here's a material, can you make this accessible for me? But that doesn't really exist for staff in most locations. I've only seen a couple of examples of where that's working really well. And then also just picking up on your point about flexibility, I've now got 2 university experiences to reflect on. My undergrad was at ANU. I was really disconnected from the concept of disability. My parents had kept me very far away from it. They'd done lots of work for me behind the scenes that I'd never seen. All of a sudden I got to university and I realized there was all this stuff that I had to think about myself. I didn't know what again, not sure what it's called here, but I didn't know what an education access plan was. I didn't know what disability services were. In my first year, I didn't personally identify as disabled or as a disabled person. So that was really challenging. I got told to unenroll from classes when lecturers didn't want to wear microphones and when they didn't want to record lectures. At ANU, we have a mandatory lecture recording policy. So there was even a book I could throw, but that requires the university to respond to that. And now at Deakin University, where I'm studying a master's in disability and inclusion as a cloud campus student, which is all online. There are some synchronous classes, but the majority of everything is self-paced. And it's academically rigorous. It's really well regarded by the disability studies sector, but it's so flexible. I haven't even gotten around to registering with disability services because I haven't needed to. It helps studying in disability studies. The vast majority of the academics have some degree of understanding of what universal design is and how to instruct in an inclusive and an accessible way. But it's really just the flexibility that solves pretty much a very large portion of my access needs. I can get a 5-day extension, no questions asked, no paperwork required. Just send an email being like, I'm handing this in 5 days later. If you're registered with disability services, you get a 10-day extension, no questions asked, no documentation required. And just having that level of trust from staff that actually, as staff and students, we are working towards the same goals here. Like, we are looking to propagate and acquire knowledge. We're looking to build skills. We're looking to create a sense of community around our field. And having that trust and that collaborative partnership, I think, has really made the difference. And now I'm so engaged in my postgraduate studies, like the deep dives, the rabbit holes, the many hours that pass, and then you realize, oh, it's like 9 p.m. and I haven't put dinner on the table yet. Getting into, you feel, it's like you get into it and it's super exciting and engaged, and you know that tomorrow you're not going to have to deal with an awful, horrible lecturer who's going to make life really difficult for you, or deal with a lecturer who's super time poor and just doesn't have time to respond to emails without taking time. Yeah, is not paid, has already done their 10 hours of paid marking, and they don't have time to give you any more feedback because they're not paid for it. Yeah. Yeah, must be nice. But yeah, so I think that flexibility, I think, is really, like you said, the key to accessible learning environments, and also that sense of trust. Like, learning has to be a partnership between, you know, the person instructing and the person learning, and also having that kind of equal relationship that, particularly, you know, in a disability studies space, there are very large portion of students who will have experiences of disability either personally or through family. And actually, in many cases, the lecturer standing at the front of the room, or, you know, who has their microphone on Zoom, as it may be more often now, they may not have all the answers, and the answers that sit in the room, and having that equal relationship there really helps to break down that kind of hierarchy that plagues us in higher education.
Yeah, to add to that, for me personally, the biggest issue was almost all of my assignments were group projects, and flexible deadlines with group projects are very difficult. And you either have lecturers that are willing to work with you or lecturers that aren't. And when I looked at the policies, even though you would have your accommodations with disability support services, the lecturer actually got the final say whether they were implemented. It's actually like they don't have to follow them, because if they think it interferes with their teaching, then they don't have to do it. And so I remember trying to get help with disability services, and they told me, oh, is your whole degree group work? And I was like, yeah. They're like, oh, maybe choose a different degree then. So that was, and you know, the person that told me this, he was disabled himself. He was the head of disability services. And, you know,
Come back later when it was better. I'm not getting better.
yeah, I was 2.5 years into my degree. I think that ship sailed. But also like other students aren't educated on disability. So when I was like having a pain flare and couldn't do my work for a couple days, and we also had this really unfortunate thing of peer assessment where you could make someone fail a grade if you were spiteful enough. And so instead of speaking to me, they would just cut me out of the group and try and make me fail units. And I have failed units because of it. And like then I have to screenshot messages and advocate my case, because we'd get forced into groups. We couldn't choose our teams because they say you don't choose who you work with in the real world. And then so I'd get ableist teammates or teammates that didn't know anything. And then converse, like just on the education piece, like staff also, even the ones that want to try their best, don't have a lot of knowledge. There's not a lot of opportunities for them to learn. And I created, I was very lucky to be paid to make a disability allyship workshop that started off in peer mentoring, and some staff had come along, and every time staff came along, they were just so thrilled to be able to learn about this. Like we talked about universal design, and they all had questions like, how can I broach this topic with my students? I think one of my students has a disability. How do I approach them? And I'd say, think about how you can apply it to the whole class. How can you pose questions so that everyone can tell you the best way they can learn? And they were like, wow. But then, and they all wanted their peers and stuff to learn as well. And then unfortunately, disability services decided that's a peer workshop that doesn't go to staff, and took it off me and cut staff off, because staff are going to do a nice little 15-minute module on legal requirements around disability. So why would they be interested in inclusion, universal design, when they know the law? So, and I think that's the biggest thing. Disability is seen as a legal matter, and everything else is seen as diversity and enriching. But disability always sits firmly in this HR category, and it's really difficult when people are thinking of prescriptive box ticking exercises to get anywhere and to get treated as a person, like give and take.
I was just going to add on that one, like talking about that legal framework and that kind of very compliance-based approach. As much as like I would love to see universities moving away from that bare minimum compliance-based approach and moving more to a human rights and an inclusion-based approach. I think that, like, in terms of your original question, Khan, like what would have really made the difference is just every single member of staff just meeting the bare minimum requirements of the disability standards for education. And for those who are fortunate enough to have not needed to be familiar with those before, they are an organ of the Disability Discrimination Act that basically gives effect to I suppose, parts of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in education settings. So they apply from early childhood all the way up to tertiary education. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They apply to tertiary education as much as you will not see tertiary represented in the research. And I can talk a little bit about that later because that's been my most recent big deep dive. But it's actually, you know, the university policy that says that, you know, the teaching staff can be the final decider of whether or not that's implemented is in direct contravention of the law. That's just not how the standards work. The standards require that there is a constant process of negotiation and conversation and dialogue, and that an outcome just has to be met. It's not up to the lecturer just to be like, no. And when the lecturers do that, or whoever, that puts the burden back on the student to have to know what their rights are around the disability standards for education and then start that appeals process. And I guess that's the big problem with the vast majority of our... Howdy. We're booked until 7:30, I think, friend. No worries. That, I guess, minimum compliance-based problem plagues all of our disability, you know, pathways, in that all of it works under the assumption that you have the energy, the resources, and the motivation to pursue a complaint if something's not working properly. And like, you know, I'm sure we've all got experiences of making complaints when, you know, it really shouldn't have been needed to have been made. But yeah, if at the very bare minimum, all staff could just be compliant with the law, because if they weren't compliant with work health and safety law, they'd have the book thrown. But for some reason, this sits in a different category, and for some reason, it's seen as okay just to treat the law as optional. And yeah, I've attempted to raise those things with universities with that lens before. They just get scared and they get litigious and they don't want to attack it in that way. But I think it's really a lens that we need to use. It's a lens that, you know, in advocacy has been effective, and it's because it's the only way that the legislation really operates is by complaint. Otherwise, if you're quiet, nothing gets fixed.
Just quickly to add, I think another thing that's really making things difficult is in all the different levels of student representation throughout universities, and just any level of decision making in the university, if there's not someone that has either personal or quite close adjacent experience of disability, it's not on their minds. And so when I was on academic board during COVID at Monash, I remember my first set of exams, so I have an accommodation that I can't do like late in the evening because of my medication. And with my time, extra time and writing time, my exam was going to be over 6 hours long. And it was starting, when was it starting? So they wanted me to finish at 9, so they pulled my start time back to 3 because everyone else was finishing at 9 and starting at 6. And I said, hey, that's actually too late. And it was an unsupervised exam, and like it was lots and lots of fighting, and the solution was that I could start at 1 p.m. However, I was supervised. No one else was supervised for this exam. So I had a Zoom video on me the whole time. And then once I finished my exam, I had to remain supervised till everyone else had finished their exam, so that I didn't go call someone and help them with their exam. So that was 8 hours of supervision. And I said, hey, I'm going to be really tired and want to sleep after this. And they said, oh, just bring the Zoom into your bedroom.
Oh my God.
Which is just not something that would ever happen to a non-disabled student, because that was being recorded as well. And, you know, in previous years, they had mechanisms for late exams. You'd sit it the next morning. And so they hadn't considered this for home exams during COVID. And so the second semester, I said, they were talking about these things in terms of offshore students, there's certain time frames, which means they would sit at a different time slot if it was too late or too early. And I said, hang on, we have a bunch of students who we've already promised this accommodation to. Can we not apply this same thing to the students with that accommodation? They were like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And we have the framework. And so the next semester when I did my exams, I just did them the next morning. And then after my exam, I had like a 15-minute oral thing, like where I just had to be like, this is my working out and how I got to the answer. It wasn't assessed. It was just to show that I had done the work. And a way better solution. But again, had I not sat in that room and say, hey, you guys screwed me so badly, and this is an accommodation we've been providing for years, that wouldn't have had infrastructure in place to allow it to happen. And it's so frustrating that it's not on anyone's minds until you put it on their minds. And currently the only solution to that is having more disabled people being able to put it on people's minds in positions of power, which is hard to infiltrate.
Yeah, I think some of the stories and reflections you guys had really, really, really strong as well in terms of, because for example, I guess one of the things you guys touched on was the inconsistency with which, I guess assign not only like disability accommodation, this would probably go into the wider world as well, even outside of universities, workplace and that kind of stuff. But in university settings, and we haven't even begun to even consider like TAFE as well, TAFE being in part of tertiary education as well. But for example, I come from, I am in two faculties, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and the law school. I noticed one thing that throughout my years here, I've been here for at least for 4 years now, nearly finished with my degree. I noticed that the arts side of my degree, much more understanding so far in my request in terms of like disability accommodation adjustment. Law school, on the other hand, much tends to be a lot harder. Even the question they ask are very different, and that it actually reminds me of something. I used to work in the student newspaper on Iswa last year, and I remember there was one time in which the medical school, there was a group of students who were studying medicine, disabled student with academic plans, so probably the closest thing to an access plan in ANU, and their adjustment in the beginning, this was for a formal exam, all voided, because the professors thought that that the accommodation variously they were described to us as extra time or differently colored paper. These were the ones that were explicitly told to us, and then a few other different adjustment. And these seem to be quite conservative as well, like the limited number of adjustment that the university here offers. In this particular instance, they were voided because the professor cited professional standards in medicine. And I guess this touches on the idea that you have on the top, I guess, like cultural attitude from the very top, as in like the professional accreditation boards and everything else, and then that feeds down. In the end, in this particular instance, the medical school overruled the particular professor, but I guess the professional attitude in terms of disability adjustment seems to be a bit of a con, a bit of a, I guess, cheat. So what are your experience or even opinion and takes on this?
Actually, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the question, but I was just going to say one of the main issues I think is the deeply adversarial nature of, like, it can be staff members, but when it is individual staff members, it's because of the structures behind them. But the assumption that it is normal to treat disabled students with suspicion, the assumption that accommodations are like unfair advantages, and the idea that that students are not here to learn, and that our job is not to teach, but to mold, to make people work ready, to gatekeep and to look out for signs of like cheating or whatever. And it's like, accommodations aren't cheating. It is the bare fucking minimum. And usually it's not enough. And I think I can count on my hands the number of wheelchair users I've ever seen around USyd in 10 years. And that is fucking tragic. But yeah, like it is really hard. You were both talking earlier about just the staff side of things as well. I think in a lot of different spaces, in education, in medicine, in law, the assumption is just that this space is not for you. And this space was not built for you, and we are doing you a favor by even letting you through the door. So just shut up and be grateful. But we used to have a lecturer in Indigenous education, Dr. Sheila Daniels Mays, who's fucking amazing and has left us for UniMelb. But she is one of, as of a few years ago, I hope that number's greater now, but it probably isn't, one of only 8 blind and low vision academics in the entire of the country. And she's a Gamilaraay woman, she's blind. When she was a child, she was assessed as being profoundly mentally retarded, was the language they used then, because she couldn't read the test. And she tells that story, and I think it's such an excellent example of how the tests are geared against us to begin with. And it's often, it's not just about the actual material, it's about everything behind it, all of the material conditions surrounding your education, surrounding your experiences on every level of your life, like housing and employment and transport and everything. There's no like one factor solution, because it's a problem that needs addressing in every area.
I think that Chloe's example of being told that you don't get to choose who you work with in the real workplace is kind of a really similar example. Or, you know, in the law context, you don't get to choose what paper your brief is printed on. And in the real world, you don't get extra time to prepare for a case. I find all of that really ironic in the context of the fact that, you know, the disability employment standards also exists, and reasonable adjustments are supposed to be provided in the workplace as well. So what people are actually saying when they say, oh, well, you don't get to choose that in the workplace, is they're saying, you know, our industry is not welcoming of people with disability and is not complying with the relevant laws that apply to workplace settings, which is a particularly disastrous thing for a law professor to be admitting to. I used to work for the ANU College of Law, which had a fantastic representation of disabled academics. And I've heard a number of stories of all of the different things they've had to do to get where they are. And it's awful that that still has to happen. But I guess that's kind of my take on, you know, that I guess this myth of the disability con, in that you would only perceive it to be a con if you yourself assume that accommodation shouldn't be made in workplace environments. And I guess that's where, you know, the relationship between education into employment and the considerations around work integrated learning or placements comes up. Who holds that responsibility? Whose responsibility is it to provide the adjustment? Is it the education provider, or is it the employment provider that you've been placed with for that particular experience? But these two experiences of education and employment are so inextricably linked, and it's really difficult to separate them, as much as we love to in the context of, you know, some of our arts disciplines, who love to be in existence for the sake of existence and for the sake of knowledge, and denounce the, you know, marketization of universities in being for the purpose of employment, which is totally a fine perspective. But it's all wrapped up regardless, because you've got to make money somehow. And in the disabled world, whether or not you are able to make money is whether or not, you know, someone's going to accommodate you. So yeah, when lecturers and professors and staff come up with those responses, it tells you a lot about how they feel employment works, just as much as how they feel education works.
I think the biggest thing to solve that, though, like, is education to staff on disability, like 101, because a lot of it is myths and misconceptions. It's where very few people is it very actively like a deep hatred for it. It's mostly a misunderstanding, them not understanding what a purpose of an accommodation is, and that it's like putting you on equal footing. Like I had one lecturer that said a good engineer is a fast engineer, and so he didn't like the idea of extra writing time because you should be able to design a bridge fast if you're gonna, and that's just not how it works in the real world. It's so funny because in the real world, engineering's so much more chill. Like, you know, not only do we always have access to the resources, never will you be designing a bridge without the textbook next to you. Have a spreadsheet that someone made 10 years ago that covers everything for you, and you'll be plotting in the numbers. Like at no point will you have to be like, oh no, I need to cross the Yarra at this point. I guess I have to design a bridge this afternoon. Like, it's just never going to happen. And so in some ways it's so tied into how it's going to your work. But in other ways they've gone so hypothetical that it's so divorced from the real world and how you would ever actually use that sort of knowledge, which I think is it's just comical to me. Like no one is ever going to have to design a bridge fast. Like, and it gets reviewed by so many people. Like engineering's the biggest group work activity, but yeah, I think education really will, like, better knowledge and awareness from staff and having a baseline at least will help fix a lot of that. And I just wanted, we talked about, you mentioned TAFE earlier.
Yep.
And I think what's interesting is that I don't know much about other state contexts, but in Victoria recently, like in the last year or two, there was the inquiry into students with disabilities in TAFE, and they did this big inquiry and there was evidence given and all of that. And from what I see, because TAFE is state-based and universities are not, all of the effort to do better is only in making TAFE more accessible. They don't really care what disabled students go to uni, or they might check out the proportion, like the enrollment number, and focus on that figure. But in terms of actual outcomes, effort made, you know, transitions from school to TAFE or school to tertiary education, TAFE is the focus because that's where the state has the power.
We have a program here at USyd called Uni to Beyond, and for the sake of not starting shit fights, I won't share too much of my opinions on it. But it's a program that markets itself as giving people with intellectual disabilities access to tertiary education. What it actually does is it lets them audit classes. They don't get a qualification out of it, and they rely on other abled students to be essentially unpaid support workers to make that happen. I think when I last checked, they were using people's NDIS funding for it, to fund it, and I think it's just a really good example of the ways that people just think this institution is not for us, or they think it's about the experience of like coming in and not like the actual fucking qualification of the learning. And that is, I mean, I think it's pathetic. And I think it's not something to celebrate if people are not actually getting good learning outcomes out of it and aren't getting qualifications that they can then use. And yeah, I think again, just the attitude of expecting us to be grateful that we can be here at all, and then not actually thinking about why we're here and what we want to get out of it.
I just wanted to quickly pick up on the point that Chloe was making around vocational education and TAFE-based settings. because this was a really big conversation that we had when we were writing the LivedX papers, which for further context were a very long series of focus groups with disabled young people from all around Australia with various different experiences and backgrounds. And we got all of these inputs from 12 focus groups or 10, something like that. And then once we had the inputs, that's when we decided what the papers we were going to write. So we yes, we still had a few focus groups left, but we didn't start the process kind of knowing exactly what was coming out of it. But when we were talking about the focus groups that we ran around tertiary settings, so we ran separate focus groups for university experiences and TAFE and RTO and vet-based experiences, which is a kind of conversation in and of itself. Why do we separate those things out? But then when we did the final write-up and we had limited resources in terms of our own time, we prioritized writing the tertiary education paper because of a very valid point that Chloe made at the time, which is there is so much more going on in the TAFE space than is going on in the university space. And the way I see why that is because TAFE is seen as a much closer link with employment. We're seeing that in the universities accord and the higher education discourse at the federal level at the moment. Jason Clare is a big fan of TAFE. He's a big fan of non-universities, and they're going to get a lot out of this term of government. Universities are not going to get much, especially given the existing discourse around the SASH issues on campuses around Australia as well. So we did this work very intentionally because there's not a lot happening, because tertiary education is still seen as a luxury, not a right. That's why we don't see a lot of research around, disabled experiences in tertiary education, because it's a luxury, not a right, as a lot of people see it. So I'm hoping to do more research into this next year as a part of my master's thesis. That's proving to be a very difficult topic to nail down because there is just so little in this space. It's a vacuum and there's so many things that we could do. But I want us to kind of see all of this as one big network of learning and opportunity between education and employment and opportunities that has so many different factors, but it's all interrelated and all affected by societal attitudes as to what education do you deserve? What education should you be pathetically grateful for through this charity model of, here, come and audit our classes, but you don't get the degree, even though you probably put more time and money into this than our able-bodied students. I know Flinders, and there's one other university that has a very similar program. I didn't know there was one here as well. I thought there were only two. But it's common, and people are really proud of them. People are really proud of these programs, and it's, it makes me really frustrated that still exists, because you have to be frustrated so that you're not sad, because there's a lot of stuff to be sad about in this sector. But, conversations like this are important, because tertiary education is not a luxury, and we need to continue to emphasize that.
Just to add quickly as well, I think a huge part of the problem there is just universities turning into profit machines, because the goal then is not educational outcomes, it's how much money the university can make off you, whether or not you get a qualification out of it. And I was going to say something, there was something you said earlier that made me, it's just gone. But I'll return the microphone and maybe think of it.
It'll come back.
Yep, I think those have been really, really good reflection, because I think one of the things that all three you touched on as well is that tertiary education right now is being looked in a very small silo by the federal government right now. I remember reading even through the Accord itself, and I remember going through, because you could do the Control F and you used the word disability. I think it was something like 10. And it was surrounding, I remember keywords were complaints pathway, better complaints pathways, very small sentence. Of course, we can't divorce the fact that the person who's leading the university court is a former university vice chancellor, particular of University of Adelaide. So particularly, I guess, like interested in terms of work, I guess in the student space, we are familiar with the fact that their interest does not correlate with that of students, particularly students with disabilities, but also other equity group as well. Again, focus a lot seemingly on enrollment rate rather than support throughout the degree. Although I'd like to note that universities do take notice, and I'll probably talk to this off off camera at some point, because they do take a lot of notice in terms of if people complain about enrollment rates or otherwise. I guess that gets me to the question of, in terms of course, we had very recently the Disability Royal Commission final report coming out, very, very long, 5,000 words, 15 volumes. A lot of discussion surrounding early childhood all the way to just stopping at 18 years old, it seems, in terms of education, leaving out entirely pretty much 1 million students, give or take, in terms of students who are post 18. Why do you think, at least with the DRC, that institution, because I guess so far we've talked about in this panel about disability adjustment, disability, and then support for disabled students, but there are also disability discrimination in terms of at an institutional level. For example, there are lots of like cases and case law. It's one of those things where disability discrimination. I remember talking to a lecturer at a law school, and he said that disability discrimination law in Australia is really hard to actually prove that, especially if you're at university and stuff, because it's really, really hard to get through. So yeah, I guess.
Yeah, just to start on the tertiary level in terms of changes that need to be made, I think horribly a lot of the time it's not that we don't know what the problems are or how to solve them, it's that there's no motivation at a structural institutional level for those changes to happen. In 2018, 2019, I was on the Disability Inclusion Access Plan, Action Plan Design Committee, and at the start of it, they were basically just like, yeah, we don't really need to change anything about this plan from the last plan because we haven't implemented anything from it. And they still haven't implemented anything from it 5 years later. And it's just like, I imagine it's just going to be the same plan again. And they were so proud of it. And then the thing is, the fucking pandemic happened. They had all the time in the world to put in the fucking tactile pathways they've been promising for years and whatever other renovations and adjustments. They had a huge, huge surplus that came off the back of a fuck ton of wage theft, among other things. But like, they had the money, they had the time, they had the opportunity, and they didn't because they didn't fucking want to, because they wanted to save money rather than make this an environment that disabled students can access. With regard to the DRC not really addressing tertiary education, I think like they did talk about like transition from school into employment. They did talk a lot about ADs and sheltered workshops and phasing them out. They talked about phasing out group homes. I think part of it is an issue of scale in terms of like universities are bad, but to my knowledge, we're not actually actively murdering disabled children. But it's also, again, just a thing of like the areas where we are most exploited, you know, they are areas like group homes and sheltered workshops where people are paid less than $3 an hour for, you know, physical exhausting labor. It's people being abused and neglected to death in institutional settings that are usually not universities, because we can't get in here. I wouldn't put it past the vice chancellor, to be honest. But don't tell him I said that. But yeah, it's I think what you were saying earlier about university being seen as a luxury and not a right is a huge part of the problem, because the DRC is focusing on really lowest of low bars survival shit, and university is seen as so many tiers above that I think it maybe wasn't really even on their radar.
Yeah, yes to all of that. And, you know, I would never want to see work being done in the tertiary sector space in, you know, largely an inherently privileged group of people with disability who have managed to get here at the expense of the incredible neglect and exploitation and discrimination that is happening in, you know, supported living and group homes and ADEs. Exactly. And no, it shouldn't have to be a competition of whose oppression is the worst, and education is always going to be part of the solution. But in addition to that, I think there's a really interesting reason why tertiary education isn't in the advocacy conversation so much. And I think it's got a lot to do with the stages of life that we're at when we come to university, largely. For a lot of us, you know, we're in this transitional period of transitioning out of school, where we've had a lot of parental support and a lot of support from school institutions, in often moving out of home, often adopting additional working responsibilities. There's a lot going on, and we're navigating a lot. We're learning how to be a human. We're learning about ourselves. And we don't have a lot of that extra time, or perhaps, you know, the practice to do that advocating at that life stage, as much as a parent of a child with disability does when they're in primary school, or a parent of an adult with disability who's living in a group home. And we do a lot of work with parents in our organisation, and parents are really powerful as a lobbying group. Parents of children with disability are very time poor, but somehow always have an opportunity to speak up on behalf of the experience of their child. And I think we can never underestimate the power of parents in elevating those conversations where children are present. And exactly, for sure. And so much of our movement wouldn't have progressed to where it is without parents. And that's not to say that parents should be speaking over the top of people with disability. Lots of parents have their own personal experiences of disability as well. I'm not saying that they should take over the advocacy conversation, and I'm sure there are lots of existing examples of where they already have. But I do think that's a really big part of why tertiary education is kind of a step behind, or many, many steps behind. We're in these vulnerable transitional stages of life that universities love to talk about. They love to talk about that post-school transition and the pastoral care and what you get in your residential hall, and your res family and all of those things. But actually what that manifests in an advocacy space is a bit of a vacuum. We're all trying our best just to, you know, look after ourselves as individuals, and there isn't as much space left until we're all on top of that, and perhaps getting to the end of our university studies where we can start to look at the collective and the group experience.
Just like it's not surprising that it wasn't in there. Like, for the things you mentioned, like it was a Royal Commission into abuse, neglect, violence, and exploitation. And when you're not somewhere, it's harder for that to happen. It still does happen, not to the same extent of violence. So it doesn't quite make the same impact when you're delivering such a gut-wrenching report. But also, like, low expectations of children with disability is a huge thing. Like, when parents are focused on their milestones and things, you know, university is, our current system is so far away from being something they can consider. And if it is considered, I feel like it's in the same realm as they consider like weddings. Like, it's like, I want my kid to go to university and have that experience I did, and then I want them to get married, like when they're having these aspirations for their children. And like Robin said earlier, it's about this experience rather than the qualification and learning and education piece. So, and I think that relates back to, you know, how there's a lot of people that go to uni, they just fall through it and it's the next step and they just kind of cruise through with no thought. I didn't think like, oh, I just finished high school, so then I went to uni and then I got this commerce degree and then I'm now working at a bank. Like, so they reflect back on this time as not like this like education, it's an experience. And so I think that, you know, when parents are thinking of their kids, they're probably thinking about more from the experience. They want their kids to have that experience. And I think that one quote in the executive summary of the Royal Commission is a parent talking about wanting her child to have the experience. Yeah, wanting her to go to school with her friends and then go to uni with her friends. It's about that experience. So like, it's no surprises it's not in there, and that's why like me and Ebe were like because it was going to be education, and we're like, can we do just higher ed? Please, because there's nothing. And like, it's hard to fight for when you don't see yourself. Staff is another, like disabled staff. I was talking to someone from Melbourne Uni who was a staff member, and I saw they're having protests at Melbourne Uni at the moment for staff rights, and like, you get accommodations through undergrad, postgrad, PhD, you become a staff member, all of those accommodations are gone. And so if, you know, you need those role models there as well, and we don't have those. It's just we're still so far behind in uni.
And I guess before we move on to questions, I think some of the reflections just now, like especially surrounding, say, disabled staff at Sydney University. There's even now there was SUPRA, so the Sydney University Postgraduate Association. They're talking to just to get one little thing for next year's even annual report is a true calculation of how many disabled staff there are, because right now the number, which is not the true number, is about 0.26% of staff being disabled. That is most likely not true. The university is not really keeping track or even asking the question of staff, because I guess, yeah. Yeah. Resource booker. Yeah, and it's really, really frustrating because it feels extremely fragmented. Dividing, I guess, like there was staff, because of course teaching staff have responsibility to students, but also staff have their own lives and all their own academic aspiration, research, everything. And even with students, there's a campaign even now going on about unpaid placement. Students now pay practically to do placements, and then even before that, we worry about doing unpaid placement. How do you even get to asking workplace adjustment? It's feeling almost like we're paying to get these placement rather than, I guess, an equitable, fair, just workplace. So it all ties down, I guess, all together. So I'd like to go to the floor, and then if you have any questions to ask of the panel. Yep, Ralph?
Yeah, I registered with Disability Services this semester, and one of my assignments, one of my subjects, I didn't get any adjustments at all. And it just so happens that this subject requires me to do an assessment every 2 weeks, which takes up to 30, 40 hours per assessment. And I just think it's just kind of bullshit that I wasn't able to get anything for that specific subject. So I was just kind of wondering, like, because it's such a faceless system as well. Like, you get one phone call with someone who works at the Disability Services Office, and then, you know, one day you just wake up and there's your academic plan. There's no reasoning given behind any of the adjustments made or why an adjustment is not made. Like, I'm just like genuinely curious, like, is it worth fighting for, what do you even do to fight for, and so forth?
Specifically to USyd on the level of disability accommodations, I would say from experience, unfortunately, it's quite fruitless to try and argue with disability services about what they should and could provide. What's a lot more fruitful is going directly to your tutor, to your lecturer, to the unit coordinator, to the disability liaison officer in your department, and there will be one. They might not be good, but they also might be. Just reach out to people in the department, the faculty, and often they can actually do a lot more, and often staff are willing to do a lot more for students than disability services will kind of imagine that they would be willing to do. And like, it's fucked that that's how the system works, because then you are relying on the goodwill of faculty members. But if you can find, and it also requires you to disclose, which is in itself fucked, but like, disability services are not allies of disabled students. They are a body of the university that is largely run by able people, designed to stop the university from getting sued. And that is basically, like, it shouldn't be their only function. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there are amazing people who work there who are willing to go the extra mile. We have a few really fantastic people in disability services here, but the really good ones are all really fucking overworked. And the limitations of their role is that they can't like redesign education from the ground up. All they can do is kind of send a letter reminding your teachers that they're meant to be providing this. They literally, I believe, have like a tick box of the types of accommodations they can offer, and it's not geared around rapidly evolving disciplines, and it's not geared around like modern assessment structures.
I guess giving a bit of the perspective of the like behind the curtain, the way a lot of this works is disability services have a little bit of a list of things that we give people with this experience, and they will copy and paste largely. And where I've seen students succeed the most is when they bring to the table what they want, basically. And we know ourselves best, and we know what's going to help us. For me, extra time in an exam makes me anxious and I get paralyzed. And so every time extra time would appear, I would be like, no, please don't do that to me because I will fail. And so what I think the role of disability collectives is agreement. What I think their role is to create, I guess, resources and databases for students to be able to bring to disability services and say, I know that, you know, this has been given in the past to people, and this is what I want. The Disability Students Association at ANU has been really effective at doing that over the years, and the disability services staff have got that. They've learned. They know that students can ask for what they want, and they know that students are all talking. They know that students will share what accommodations they got with other students. And I think that collectives have a really big role to play in being like a centralising location for that knowledge base, and giving you the tools to go to disability services and say, this is what I want, and know that that is reasonable and it is necessary for you because you know yourself. And I think that's the way that as students we create cultural change in the institution, because the institution isn't going to change itself. Yeah, really important role for collectives. I can't speak to, you know, the system here at this university, but I know that there has been progress made over time at ANU. It didn't used to be as it is now. It's still not great, but it's getting there. Yes, exactly. Like, I didn't think I was going to sit here talking about organising tonight. I was saying to my partner before I came, I was like, I think I'm going to be the least radical person on this panel. But now I'm the one talking about organising. Oh dear, that happened. But yeah, I think that, you know, Khan, you and your collective have a really important role to play in providing that knowledge base that, you know, propagates over time and becomes more rich and becomes more powerful for students to use and access.
Sorry, just a very quick comment. I think like the institutional knowledge data or that often get lost really easily, and resources like even now, lack of resources for international students. I organized like Disability Hub basically with SUPRA, with the Postgraduate Association, and we get laughed a lot by international students. But the thing is, a lot of students, for example, who come from who don't speak English as a first language, often students don't understand what what support they can access. Are they even disabled? Like, is that thing what you said, like the first year, now it could even be their whole entire degree without even knowing it. And again, that stigma, and then a lot of students, for example, maybe even look through the information, take it, does not say anything. But I say, like, approach it with like understanding, but yeah, is that providing of resources and stuff as well. Sorry, Chloe.
No worries. Yeah, on your point about like collective knowledge was what I was going to say, which was during those focus groups, I think the most precious thing that came about of it was everyone being like, oh, I use this accommodation. And everyone's like, oh, and then they were sharing ideas about what accommodations they had. And like, I'm very lucky in that, like at Monash, it's not when you get the form filled out by your health professional, your diagnoses don't go on it. Your doctor just ticks off the adjustments that are necessary for you, and then you can add any extra ones. And then we have a conversation with our person. I never knew the word for them, but that was your person, and you met with them at the start of every year, and you know they would try and make, and unless it was to do with grading or assessments specifically, you need a letter from a health professional, but otherwise it could be done as long as it was realistic. And so I think, like, I don't know if they do this anymore, but I remember the first NUS disability student conference. It was held at Monash. I think 2019 it was. And events like that are really important for you all as collectives to compare notes about how each university is doing their disability support services, because and like being able to go, and depending on the university, I know at Monash the very convincing thing is, well, this group of 8 university is doing this, and you can build your case that way. So more on the advocacy perspective, not the individual student, but having that, like, well, this many universities are doing it this way. This prescriptive approach is not being used by very many people at all, like, and it can be done. And having that, well, they're doing it, is much easier than going, we want this. It's this university is doing it better. And universities don't like when another university is doing something better. Unless it's student satisfaction. They seem to ignore that. But I think that role of talking throughout the country, because I was shocked to learn the vast differences in even special consideration and the way that works. They've implemented now across the whole university at Monash 2-day, no questions asked extension, because the arts faculty have been doing it forever. So, you know, and then because we found out the art students were doing it, and there was advocacy, and now all the faculties have it. But then, like, taking that momentum and using it on another campus, like, I think that's, we need to all be talking to each other, because there are all these little wins happening, and they don't need to be in isolation. Like, we're fighting this so much on our own and not taking enough lessons learned. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I was just about to ask about to say it very quickly, because you said like automatic simple extension. I think like the comparison note is point actually really useful, because USyd have 5 days simple extension, same system, although they did try to reduce it down to, what was it, 2 days? 3.
But it's
And
5. But we killed it. The proposal.
We won.
killed it by a very marginal vote. I think it was. So the university is definitely going to try that again. But again, like picking up momentum, sharing knowledge among, like solidarity among each other, don't have to be, I guess, like isolated, because we're all in this together, like across the country, and sharing knowledge and everything, and then I guess teaching each other as well. So yeah, I think that's really, really valuable.
To add to that, I remember one of the points that we would use in academic board is when you look at the stats of young people experiencing mental ill health and considering that anxiety and depression are reasons to be part of the disability department, 100%. But if you say, like, you know, this many percent of students should be like, this affects all of these students, you know, it's not a niche fringe issue when you're considering mental ill health as well. Like, it's a majority. And, you know, the number, when you talk about the impacts like that, you stop being able to be like this little fringe little pocket where even though they yell really loud, there's only a few of them. So we can just pretend, you know, you can make it more relevant by reminding them that, you know, mental ill health after the pandemic is spiked. There's student well-being is a buzzword that they like mental health, well-being, those sorts of things. They don't really respond that well to disability. Oh yes. Is that coming across law faculties? Yes. But yeah, there are ways to like play to their cards. Do you know what I mean? And also in like rallying up support and allyship, making the vast body of students understand that as someone who experiences, you know, depression or anxiety, they can also get support and accommodations, making it relevant to them as well. So you have bigger masses, like people, like they're so mystified and distant from disability. Like, it takes a lot of us a long time to realize we are disabled, and it's so far away. It's really hard to break into the mainstream. Like, the only time we've seen it happen is with the independent assessments, and that was when the whole community was really together. But yeah, I don't really know where I was going other than it affects more people than they want. As long as they can pocket it as a fringe issue, it's harder to get anywhere.
Yep. I think just in the interest of time, I'll just have some, I guess, like final panel reflections. I think like what so far we've been said, like this, like I think we've learned really, really a lot from what Robin, what Ebe, and also Chloe said about basically about the intersection between disability and higher education. Oh, sorry. Between like disability and higher education, like it's easily like under normal circumstances so far this year sometimes feel very like, for example, I myself as a disabilities officer feel somewhat sometimes like, am I really affecting change? How do I affect change? That question always like comes up all the time. Like this year, I guess I align myself more with Supra, and then also with the USU as well. Now that there's a disability portfolio holder, also there are other faculties as well. Faculties that are jumping on, getting on to having disabilities portfolio holders. The business school just established their own disabilities portfolio holder for the first time. I mean, there are also perception in terms of, because disability and I guess equity, diversity, and inclusion plans now directly contributes to university ranking, but that's a whole other topic that I could go on forever. Oh my God. Universities work a lot on media perception, but I think sometimes like, again, what I think, especially Chloe have said before, and then Ebe have said before as well, is that we, I guess, not sure again like fringe, but looking ways so that we can make this discrimination or like the ableism we face into public issues. I remember actually that because I remember reading, I recommend it actually, the late Professor Mike Oliver at Kent University, many others who pioneered, I guess, what now becomes a social model of disability, many pioneers of that theory. And I guess turning into that public issues, making the conversation like alive and well, and that's through our experiences, through data, through all of that coming together, and then working together as well, because that's crucial. All right. And then with that, thank you very much for Robin, Evie, and Chloe for coming tonight. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, despite the rainy the rainy evening. And yeah, thank you very much.